Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us today. On behalf of the Online Events Committee and Young Scholars Committee, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. These events include Spanish interpretation, which you can access by clicking the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Welcome you all. My name is Yazgı Genç. I'm a resident PhD from University of Utah and member of IAFFE Online Event Committee and Young Scholars Committee. Today's event is a part of an ongoing Fireside Chat series that provides the opportunity to deep dive with IAFFE scholars on their works, including books that they have recently released, which we will be discussing: Feminist Political Economy, A Global Perspective, written by great Sara Cantillon, Odile Mackett, and Sara Stevano. Here. The previous events in this series are available on IAFFE's YouTube channel, and today's event will be also recorded and posted IAFFE's YouTube channel. So we also have online events in numerous other event tracks, so please look out for more information regarding those upcoming events and catch up on the past events you may find on IAFFE's YouTube channel. And this is a Zoom meeting and it's not a webinar, so it's a friendly reminder to keep yourself muted. And there will be a Q&A section of this event, which we will invite you to use the raise hand function to ask your questions. And also, please feel free to put your questions, comments, and share the resources throughout the chat. And I will be moderating this event, which will feature discussions with the author's latest book. It offers a detailed discussions on feminist political economy and align with several perspectives on the intersection of gender, class, race, and power in global economic system. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the authors of Feminist Political Economy, A Global Perspective, for today's event. So Sara Cantillon is a professor of economics and director of the Wyss Center for Economic Justice at Glasgow Caledonian University. She is also the next president of IAFFE. And Odile Mackett is an associate professor of economics at the School of Business Leadership at the University of South Africa. And last but not least, Sara Stevano is a senior lecturer in economics at SOAS University of London. So Sara Cantillon, Odile, and Sara Stevano, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. First of all, so I want to start by saying that I love the book, of course, and I know many other scholars who felt the same way. And it's my great pleasure to host you today and have the opportunity to ask you a question about your amazing work. And I have specific questions for each of you for the next 45 minutes. But if you would like to add anything to your co-author's response, please feel free to jump in. And I would like to start with Sara Cantillon by asking what you and your co-authors' main goal was in writing this book, and how did you come to write this book, and where the idea and inspiration comes from, and how did you guys meet? How did you find each other?
Okay, but firstly, can I start off by saying thank you, Yazgı, on behalf of the three of us, for your invitation and for organizing this IAFFE Fireside session. It's really great to see so many of these events online and to see participation by IAFFE members and friends. The main goal of the book, well, it's primarily intended as a textbook designed to support teaching and learning in the field of feminist political economy. It's aimed at advanced undergraduate and postgraduate students across the social sciences. Our idea in writing the book was to systematize the rich and complex body of knowledge in feminist political economy and provide an overview of its foundational insights and debates. And that sounds, straightforward enough, but it was actually quite challenging, as we don't have very many examples of textbooks on feminist political economy. And there was also the challenge of trying to define the growing field of feminist political economy and to identify its boundaries. The literature is not typically presented in a systematic form. Often feminist approaches to political economy or economics or other fields tend to be considered specialized fields of study for those who have a specific interest in gender inequality. But we believe, as I imagine many others in this audience do too, that feminist approaches should be considered foundational or core to our understanding of the economy. Therefore, in trying to structure this literature in a textbook, we are trying to establish feminist political economy as a coherent body of knowledge that is essential to anyone interested in understanding socioeconomic systems. As for the idea for the book you asked, it came from, in the first place, from Alison Howson in Agenda Publishing. Diane Elson and myself are editors of the Gendered Economy book series, and it was through that relationship that the idea was suggested. However, having agreed to do it, I found myself struggling with the enormity of the task. And around that time, I was in a lot of contact with Naila Kabir, as she was chair of the IAFFE conference that we hosted in Glasgow in 2019, I think it was. And fortuitously, Naila recommended Sara. And then sometime after the two of us began to struggle time-wise, Sara came across Odile's work and Odile joined us. So we're very grateful to Naila for her matchmaking skills. But if I could just maybe finish by saying that I think that the triple authorship has made the book much greater than the sum of its parts. That we are three feminist scholars committed to a power-centered understanding of the economy. And that in the end, we not only managed to produce the book, but made lasting friendships.
Oh, thank you. It was beautiful. Odile, so I have a question for you regarding the title of the book. So the book is titled Feminist Political Economy, A Global Perspective. So I'm curious about what this title signifies. So why is it referred to feminist political economy rather than just political economy? And also, what is the added value of feminist political economy in the book? And why does it emphasize a global perspective? So basically, I try to ask, what does feminist political economy entail, and why is it important to discuss from a global standpoint?
Thank you for the question. So in the intro, we provide an overview of how feminist political economy relates to political economy. And we also touch on the overlap between feminist economics, feminist political economy, and intersectional political economy. But we really draw out how feminist political economy is related to political economy. So the chapter also includes a brief history of how political economy thinking has evolved, and how the discipline of economics was shaped from this thinking. So if we think of political economy as the study of how different economic theories and systems reflect the political context in which they operate, or how political forces shape economic transactions, feminist political economy helps us add a dimension to this thinking, which tends to be gender blind. So it does so firstly by broadening the limits of inquiry of political economy and mainstream economics beyond the state and the market to include the household and the community, and the types of work which takes place in these institutions. And it also highlights the relations within them. It secondly moves beyond gender inequalities to think about how class, race, issues of power, and so on affect our economic and social interactions, and emphasizes how these are intertwined and necessary for the functioning of the economy. It then also uses a broader range of methodological approaches, borrowing from disciplines beyond those with a quantitative focus. The second element, which is the global perspective, highlights the need to understand contemporary inequalities in a global perspective. So countries, communities, economies are now more than ever connected to one another, and they are also historically connected. So our most recent example of COVID-19, for instance, showed us that crises require a coordinated response between countries, but also how quickly we are all affected by a single problem. Historically, taking a global perspective can help us understand how contemporary inequalities have come about and how countries are connected, or the connections between them have fostered these inequalities. It can also help us understand why these inequalities continue to exist, as many of these unequal relations continue to exist between different countries and regions of the world. So bringing a feminist lens to this debate helps us to connect not just countries, but different groups of people, and assist us in understanding how the work, for instance, of a female farmer in Africa can be linked to the profit margins of a large multinational corporation in America. Without a global perspective, we're not able to make these connections. And so that's why we have both of the elements in the title.
Perfect. Thank you. And then my next question is for Sara Stevano. So the book explores so many different themes, like from social reproduction, care economy, labor market inequalities, inequalities in the household, like so many different themes that we see in this book. And all these themes are discussed through the intersectionality of race, gender, class, and power. And I know that you emphasize in your previous interviews too that this intersectionality is the key element in this work. So could you start by defining your understanding of intersectionality and explaining why it is so important in this book? Like, how does the book incorporate and address this intersectionality concept, and what unique insights does the book offer in this regard?
Thank you so much, Yazgı. And you are giving us the chance to really expand a little bit on a theme that we wanted to be quite central in the book. So that's great. So maybe I will start by saying a few words on what intersectionality is. And of course, I'm sure that everybody in this audience is familiar with the term, and people will have their own understandings of it. But just, to clarify the meanings of it. So, of course, intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the early 1990s. And Kimberly Crenshaw is a feminist legal scholar. So she works on civil rights and critical race theory. And the way in which intersectionality was conceived at first was with specific application to a legal domain, so to speak. And it was about specifically the interaction of gender and race. Now, of course, the reason why we are talking about intersectionality today is because the concept has traveled long and far since that time in the early 1990s. And it is now used across the social sciences and beyond. And it has been extended in multiple ways, not least to think not only about the interaction between gender and race, but also class, caste, religion, migration status, and whichever other axis of power that might be specific in a given context. I'm aware that there is a great audience joining this meeting from different parts of the world, so everybody will be aware that in their own context, there are different relations and axes of power that might matter in different ways. So intersectionality is about foregrounding this interaction of multiple relations of power, right? Now, what is also interesting from my perspective is that intersectionality not only has traveled in multiple ways, but it also has different or a specific root in radical thinking. So even before the language of intersectionality as such was introduced, we have a lot of examples coming particularly from Black radical thought that affect, and activism, in fact, not only scholarship, but also activism, putting forward what de facto is intersectional thinking without calling it intersectional, so to speak. So I'm thinking about the work by Angela Davis or the Black Combahee River Collective and how those responses were framed particularly as a reaction to, for example, orthodox Marxism and their singular focus on class, at the expense of gender and race, but also to some strands of Marxist feminisms that were particularly concerned with intersection between class and gender, but didn't quite look at race, and also forms of sexism in US Black civil rights movements, where particularly women active in these movements wanted to center questions of gender alongside race. And so I think that in feminist thinking and beyond, very often we form our understanding of foundational issues, so not only through the scholarship that uses a particular lexicon, but also through the scholarship that tells us something about these realities using different grammars. And this is particularly the case for social reproduction. I think this is the case for intersectionality. So my own understanding of intersectionality comes, is integrated in this radical genealogy of thinking. And if you're interested in this, there is this very nice paper by Sara Salem, which we do cite in the book in chapter 1, which provides this genealogy. So if you want to read about it, I would recommend that. But I would also recommend to read Angela Davis' Women, Race and Class, which I think is a masterpiece of intersectional thinking. And so understanding intersectionality in this tradition means to, from my perspective, is about thinking of it not in individual terms, but as a structural phenomenon. Where really we think about the interaction of different forms of oppression and exploitation in relation to how the division of labor has been historically and contemporarily organized, both in production and in reproduction. So that is, to basically answer your question on how I understand intersectionality. And in this sense, in our book, intersectionality is a core component of the global perspective that Odile was just talking about. So in a way to take a global outlook in the field of feminist political economy, from my perspective, is somewhat impossible to do so without an intersectional lens that captures these different forms and multiple forms of oppression at different scales, in local contexts, but also in the functioning of the global economy. And to be a little bit more concrete and complete this answer in terms of how the intersectional lens, how we have tried to sort of bring it into the book throughout. So there are different ways in which we've done so more concretely. The first is by starting with this macro historical and structural framing that is, foregrounding the history of the international division of labor from colonialism to the present time as the general, landscape through which we should understand contemporary hierarchies in the global economy. But then also every chapter has specific case studies where we try to, shine a light on how, power relations work in the economy and in relation to specific themes and topics from across the world. So bringing in the global south and the global north, so to speak. Sorry, that was somebody buzzing, but I won't take this now. And then this was more difficult, this third and last way in which we try to bring it in. It is through trying to bring a truly global, or particularly a global South lens into feminist theorizing. And that means that, it's not only important to think about case studies and applications, but to use, the material and the realities from all over the world to, in a foundational way, to think about how we can conceptualize certain feminist pillars. And arguably, we've done this to the extent that is allowed by the literature that is out there, and surely we could have done it better in certain ways, but we've tried to do so, for example, on the topic of social reproduction, on how we understand households. But I think we do recognize that, you know, the journey to, if you want to decolonize feminist political economy is still quite long ahead of us. But in a way, we have tried to move a little step in that direction.
Wow, thank you. So, and then something related to what you just said, that every chapter of the book start with historical concepts, like you guys start with historical facts, and then you move to theoretical part, and then you move to policy perspective supported by empirical evidence, and also the latest debates, and also the contemporary issues. So, and I think this consistent approach make the book, it's a brilliant textbook because it's so kind of straightforward to read every chapter, since it follows the same approaches. And I want to ask, like, Sara Cantillon, like, why do you believe it's important to start with historical data to understand the latest debates and contemporary topics? So while this might be obvious to many feminist researchers today, and I was wondering, like, how would you explain its significance to your students or the audience here who are kind of new to feminist political economy? Why did you adopt this pattern? Like, why did you start with historical perspective, then move on the theoretical part, and then move on the policy perspective of each topics that you covered?
Okay, well, as I said earlier, it's designed as a textbook. So in terms of style, each chapter follows a similar format. The discussion of the topic of the chapter, which is then followed with a set of takeaway messages, suggested questions, and you know, a list of different resources and links that can be used by readers to expand engagement with specific issues. And as Sara just mentioned there, we also incorporated case studies in each chapter that provide, you know, empirical evidence or policy perspectives or programs, often focusing on specific countries. And we really tried to draw these case studies from a range of countries in both the global north and the global south. And you asked about the emphasis on a historical approach. And I think this goes very much hand in hand with why we argue that a global perspective is necessary. And I think, as Odile emphasized in her response, and indeed Sara drew on it as well, we felt obviously that a global perspective was necessary because it provides a much needed contribution to a gap in this area. But the reality of today's totally globally interconnected world, as Odile was saying, is one aspect, but it's not the only aspect, because contemporary global hierarchies are historically determined, and as Sara said, determined by gender, race, and class. So this late 20th century globalization is only the most recent iteration of a much longer process of the internationalization of production and exchange that can be, you know, traced back for centuries. What has changed with the different phases are the modes of integration, and especially, I think, in the global division of labor underpinning specific forms of production and exchange. Likewise, the history of patriarchy is relevant to both our current version of capitalism and to alternative economic systems, as it helps explain how capitalism has evolved and also how it's likely to evolve. And I think in this regard, maybe chapter 2, which was primarily authored by Sara, is the key chapter in relation to this historical view, because it frames the book as a whole. And it starts with an account of the colonial origins of the international division of labor, the contrasts visions of capitalist development as a linear process with those that highlight its polarizing tendencies, which are of course shaped by gendered and racialized global division of labor, and that brings us right up to contemporary issues such as the process of precarious labour on a global scale. So I suppose what we are trying to do, albeit in our own limited way, is to provide an account of key feminist political economy topics that consider the importance of both the location of both location hierarchies, past and present, to help illustrate the intersecting inequalities of global capitalism.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think that was my favorite part about the book, like starting with the historical facts and then kind of link those history to the current debates. Like in some points for especially for the teams that I'm not super familiar with it was really like a satisfactory reading in that sense. So like you all underline that the one of the purpose is to provide a textbook and make feminist political economy more accessible and engaging for students. So I have a question for Sara Stevano, and I want to ask, like, how can we use this book when teaching introductory courses? Like, how can principal courses benefit from the feminist political economy approaches you highlighted in the book? Like, what are the ways that you are planning to incorporate these books in the principal courses?
Yeah, great. So yes, I'll come to provide an answer to your question specifically on introductory courses, but just to preface that by saying that normally feminist political economy or feminist economics are taught either in the context of specialized courses or through integrating feminist insights into foundational courses in economics or political economy, let's say. So when it comes to specialized courses, I think that probably this material is a little bit more advanced, and so it can be found in final year undergraduate programs or in postgraduate programs. And I don't know about the context where everybody who's joining here, how this works, but in the UK, which is where I am based, there are very few economics departments that offer specialized courses in feminist economics or feminist political economy. So this is, I think, a critical gap in the economics curriculum, because this is exactly the type of systematic teaching on these subjects that is missing for many economics students. And of course, I think that all of us here consider this to be a key limitation. But in terms of more introductory courses, I think that the most effective way that this book could be used in order to bring these feminist insights into teaching is by integrating, some key feminist insights essentially into the teaching of specific topics that are foundational in economics and political economy degrees. So I'm thinking about work, employment, labor markets, economic crisis, poverty and inequality. These are all topics that when first introduced, including to first-year undergraduate students, then we could immediately bring in some feminist perspectives in order to introduce this way of thinking early on. So this is how I would use it in this way, alongside, of course, the general principle that doesn't come only from feminist approaches to political economy and economics, that is about foregrounding the importance of power relations and hierarchies in the functioning of economic systems, right? And this comes from many heterodox schools of economic thought. But yeah, so this is what I would say. And one last thing that I want to mention is that particularly as, there is an increasing concern and interest in understanding inequality, I see this as a critical entry point for feminist thinking. And I think that this is what we try to do in this book, right? This is the framing to say, okay, feminist political economy is foundational to the understanding of socioeconomic inequalities. So if you are interested in understanding inequality issues, this is foundational knowledge, which is, I think, something that Sara has already mentioned a few minutes ago. But yeah, I will leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you. Odile, I have a question for you. As a you are also like a member of the Young Scholars Committee under IAFFE, and I know that you're also a recent PhD graduate, and it's great that you're already making amazing contributions, and I am super excited to see what's next on your agenda. And I know that you have a brilliant YouTube channel that you provide some resources for young researchers through your research journey. So I want to ask, like, what advice would you give to young scholars who is also considering writing a book, or also kind of thinking about writing a book?
Thanks for the question. So I think that writing with two experienced scholars is obviously very helpful from my perspective. So both Sara and Sara have been very supportive throughout the process. And I learned a lot from them, and I also have both of them to thank for this wonderful opportunity. But being part of IAFFE, I think, has also been key for me. So as I've now learned, like a lot of other people in IAFFE, and also funny enough in other disciplines who do similar types of work, I find it difficult to sort of find expression for my work where I am, and being part of IAFFE has been key to the acknowledgement and justification of that work. So for me, it's about having that community of practice, not just to communicate and collaborate with more senior scholars, but also with my peers. So I think it's important to have a good mixture of both. And I've certainly have had productive collaborations with both groups as a result. So yeah, that's sort of what I can say on that. Yeah, thanks.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, I'll recommend to everyone to check out the Odile's YouTube channel. It's just amazing. So I have a question for all of you. So, like, were there any surprises or unexpected findings in the process of writing the book or in response to book? What would you say about that? It's an open floor for all of you.
Shall I go first? Yeah. Okay. So I think like one surprise for me was to basically realize that working on this book alongside Sara and Odile has in a way reshaped a little bit my understanding of feminist political economy. So I think that I started with a certain I realize now very vaguely defined understanding, probably, where I had good knowledge of specific issues and some literature in the field in relation to specific issues. So, but I realized that I had not sufficiently reflected on what the field is as a whole, probably, or maybe like I did have some ideas because I did read all of the foundational feminist economic literature, particularly Julie Nelson and so forth, the setting the parameters of the field. But in a way, writing the book has challenged those initial beliefs. And so that was quite surprising that, writing the book, I would have not have expected that it would have entailed that kind of journey. And I think that this was also one of the challenges that we encountered, that at first we thought it might be relatively easy to write up some of the teaching material that we all had, because we had all been teaching in different capacities on these topics. And in fact, it turned out to be quite a more of a complex exercise. So that's one thing, but then I'll give the floor to my co-authors to add their own reflections.
Well, yeah, I agree, of course, with that. It was the surprise in it was that it was much harder than we imagined. I think we kind of perhaps quite naively thought, oh, that's fine, we teach a lot of this stuff, so let's just draw on what we already have. We already have, different resources. We're familiar with the literature and we have slides. But as we began to do it, as Sara has already outlined, new questions emerged, and we kind of began to change how the book was going to be structured and why it was so important, for example, to put that chapter 2 that we were talking about as a chapter to frame it And as I said earlier, the challenges of defining the growing field of feminist political economy and what its boundaries are, and how it then also overlaps with other disciplines like feminist economics, like development economics, gender and economics, the other different streams that are very interested in some of the same topics. I suppose we are very grateful to colleagues at our own institutions and elsewhere for ongoing conversations on these topics, and to Diane Elson and Liz Osame for giving us feedback on earlier drafts of the book. And just while I'm at it, I would really like to give a shout out to Sarah Riccio, who was a research assistant throughout this, and her help was invaluable, especially with the case studies, but just in the overall production of the book.
Yeah, so from my side, I think what was perhaps the most challenging was sort of reconciling the global North and global South literature into like a coherent chapter. I think often, we tend to look at the one or the other. And so just sort of bringing in those perspectives and trying to create coherence, which is unfortunately not always there, right? As economists, we're sort of used to, fitting things into these neat models. And so I think that was like more messy than I thought it was going to be, and having to make decisions about, what to put in and what to leave out, and which parts of the literature to highlight. Because of course, we're also looking at literature from other disciplines and arguments from a variety of scholars. So yeah, for me, that was definitely a learning experience. And then of course, learning stuff that, was sort of beyond my scope of knowledge at the time about some of the other topics that are in the book.
Oh, right, thank you. So I have one last question before I open the floor for audience. So I am wondering, like, what is your favorite chapter in the book and why? Like, is there any chapters that you like more than others?
Well,
And then this is a question for you all.
Sorry, will I jump in first here? I was just going to say, I know I've mentioned it a number of times, but I suppose chapter 2 is such an important chapter in the book. I think it does an amazing job of setting out the framework from which the book progresses. And as I said, Sarah was the primary author of that, and she did a wonderful job on it. And particularly, as I said, in terms of highlighting the colonial origins of capitalism and an awful lot of contemporary issues that we're dealing with today. I also, of course, in terms of what Odile was saying there, Odile had a very difficult job because, coming from it, particularly looking at economic crises and then trying to bring and merge the two, perspectives from maybe the global North and global South on that, and the whole nature of the instability of economic crisis, and how it's almost that in itself is almost a constant. And finally, I like chapter 11 only insofar, because it's the most boring of them at one level, but I like it insofar as it offers some hope on alternative ways of understanding and measuring economic and social progress, and shows how much better outcomes are possible if we push hard enough to achieve them.
So for me, I think this is an easy one. I definitely love the chapter on social reproduction. I think social reproduction is really topical at the moment, and I know, like, for young scholars like myself, a very intimidating topic. We all want to know more about it, but we're all too scared to get into it because, we might make a mistake in our arguments. But I think the chapter is sort of written in a very accessible way, I would say, and it's sort of dumbs it down, if I can call it that for lack of a better term. I think the political economy literature tends to be very complex and difficult to understand, and very dense. And so I like the way the social reproduction chapter sort of illuminates some of the complex issues within social reproduction without the political economy language. That makes sense.
Yeah, so for me, I know that it was already mentioned by Sara, but I really like the chapter on crisis that Odile led on. I think is quite useful for anybody who wants to have some, foundational insights on how to think about crisis from a feminist perspective. I think it is a great starting point. And then, to add basically, a little bit of a story and include a chapter on care in this list of favorite chapters. At some point, we were not sure whether we would write a chapter on care and one on social reproduction. And then we decided to go ahead, and two of us took the lead on these two different chapters. And then we realized that indeed these are concepts that have many areas of overlap, but they also speak to distinct debates. And I really love the way in which this difference emerged from the writing of these chapters, sort of in a more it wasn't something that it was thought in advance. Okay, so the chapter on care will do this and the chapter on social reproduction will do this, but it sort of happened in the writing. So that was also like a key learning process for me, I would say.
Yeah, that was it was interesting to read the social production chapter and then read the care chapter and then see that there's a clear division you guys made in the book. So my favorite one is chapter 2 too, like global division of labor. I don't know, it was so enlightening for me. Maybe it includes a lot of things that I don't know. So that was like a good introductory chapter for me to understand. Thank you so much for all of your answers. It was amazing. So I want to kind of open the floor for the audience. So you can put your questions on the chat, or you can basically use the raise hand function of the Zoom and ask your questions individually. Yeah. Feel free to use the chat or raise your hands to ask questions for our audience. Yeah, we have first hand Marcela Corsi. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So hello, everybody. Hello, Sara, and Odile. As you know, I'm a fan of your book. I'm translating it into Italian. So first of all, I really want to take this opportunity to congratulate with this great achievement. We really needed a book like this. So really thanks. And my question is just about numbers. We usually draw by numbers. So how did you decide to take some numbers in some chapters and avoid numbers in other chapters and so on? So I just realized this translating, of course, the book into Italian. There are differences among chapters in terms of the statistics that you involve. So it's just because each of you have a different, I don't know, idea about using numbers, or it was really something that you decided collectively? Just out of curiosity, of course. The result is excellent anyway, so just to know.
Okay, I'll jump in to say it wasn't something we decided. It's just kind of happened organically. How we organized it was each of us took primary responsibility for different chapters. And then so one person would be primary responsible, and then the others would, add or add to them or read them and comment or whatever. And then, a couple of the chapters we kind of wrote jointly. But I think it really reflects just either style, interest, or just availability, you know, whether it made sense or whether to more stand at, you know, at a more theoretical level. So like, you know, when I was saying earlier about the consistency in the format, obviously we missed that bit in terms of the consistency.
Could I maybe just add, thank you, Marcella, for the question. Yeah, I mean, of course, as Sara said, and I suppose that many decisions were made in a pragmatic way, because as I'm sure you know, and many others here know, it's always a bit of a challenge to fit in the time for a book project within a full-time academic job. So we had to be pragmatic. But let's say that for me, in hindsight, yeah, you know, clearly there is not, you know, the consistency across the chapter is not quite there. But in a way, you know, I think that this is a way of showing how feminist political economy is a very diverse field of academic inquiry. And probably I do take that it might have been better to retain more of these differences within a specific, in the discussion of specific topics. But, you know, in like in the way that we did it, I think different chapters put across slightly different ways of doing feminist political economy, both theoretically and methodologically. And yeah, so that the book offers a representation of this as well.
So then, if I may add just a suggestion for the second edition, just add an appendix about, you know, statistics, useful links or whatever. I mean, if you want, we can even, I mean, since in any case, I will have to write a sort of complementary chapter for my students, since I have a specific module on gender statistics in my course. So if you want, I can send you then my slides, and those are yours. I mean, you can do whatever you like with that. For the future, of course, second edition.
Thank you.
Are you saying you don't want to be part of the second edition?
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the question. We can have like a couple of more questions. Let me see if there's any raised hands. Okay, Elisa.
Hello. Okay, I was debating whether to ask this question. So first of all, I'll just say I haven't read the book yet. But I'm hoping you can enlighten me. So I'm currently studying education and planning, economics and international development. It's a master's in a UK university. And currently writing my dissertation. And I wonder if, because I'm currently looking into topics that are really, really relevant, especially around economics of education and how, well, it's quite influenced by neoclassical economics theory. And I was wondering if in your book, you have written or you have seen anything that may relate to education. I mean, I think everything kind of relates to education there. But yeah, I think I was wondering if anything comes to mind that you think could be interesting for me to look into, because I think there's obviously a lot of intersections between topics. So yeah, thank you.
I'll maybe take this one. Thanks for the question, Elisa. So I think the most obvious chapter that might relate to education is probably the labor market inequalities chapter. As we know, you know, the relationship between your level of education and where you are in the labor market is sort of, you know, central to labor economics. That's the only one I can think of. I'm sort of thinking of the feminization of poverty, but I don't know if there's anything there. I can't recall now if there's anything that touches on education.
I'll just jump in. Sorry, Sarah, if you want to jump in, but just I'm thinking not so much from this book, but something that you may find useful is a book by Kathleen Lynch on care and capitalism. And she talks a lot about education and the reproduction of inequality. I mean, that's mainly her area, her whole career, or the main body of her research is in that area. But in her recent book, there's overlaps between her focus on care and capitalism and educational inequality.
There's two more questions in chat. It says like, how can we access the book? What would you say about that? Like, is there any tips and tricks for especially for students? Like, how can we access the book?
So I don't see the question in the chat, but if there is if the question comes from a student in a university, I think that probably the best is to ask the library of the university to get a copy of the book. I'm aware that a number of university libraries in the UK have it, and probably also beyond, but yeah, I'm not very sure how many libraries might have it, but it's always possible to request books, so that's the best way, or yeah, I mean, the price of the book, particularly the ebook or the paperback version, are relatively accessible by the standards of academic publishing. But yeah, or at home is saying get any copy of the book that can have multiple users. Yeah, that's another good point. Yeah.
Also add that, well, via my institution, I found it on JSTOR, but it seems not everyone has access to that. So you might just want to check on via your institution whether you have that access on JSTOR.
Okay. Great. So there's one exciting questions that did writing the book inspire any future research that you didn't already have in mind, or any future book? Like, are we going to see any future book from you three? That's a question from Paulina.
So, well, there is a second edition of this book that keeps on coming up, and I know that particularly Sara is very afraid at this prospect. No, so of course now it's basically just a joke, but you never know. But for me, I must say, so I found it a bit difficult, as I was saying before, to find the time to push the book forward. I mean, and also in the meantime, the COVID-19 pandemic happened, and I think for all of us, it was quite challenging, to be honest, to find the time. But I must say that once the book was out, it was incredibly rewarding to have, a concrete and tangible output as opposed to an academic paper. So that that made me think that I don't have any concrete idea on a book that I might want to work on at the moment, but it is something that I have in mind for the future. Yeah.
We do joke about the second edition only because we keep thinking of topics that could have gone in, and then we say, oh, second edition. But I don't know about that at the moment. I mean, I think definitely, there's always more work to do, and there's things that came up in it, and also maybe something, that's looking forward into the future a little bit in terms of transformative strategies, maybe particularly around care and social reproduction, and just how, making them so central to the functioning of the economy, and getting that recognized as being so central might be one avenue. But just in terms of, it has been just fantastic, the response to the book. And one thing that three of us really enjoyed, we were in Berlin recently, at the Institute for Political Economy, the Pluralist Economics project there, I think it was through Exploring Economics, had asked us to do an online module for students with the book as the core text. And so we did that for them last autumn, and they took the module, and then we got to meet them in person. The three of us traveled to Berlin in early May, and it really was incredibly gratifying and satisfying for so many students, and so many male students who are studying feminist political economy and feminist economics, to tell us how much they'd got from it and how much they enjoyed the case studies. So I think, as Sara said, the post experience kind of justifies the pain. Odile, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, no, I'm covered. Thanks.
Yeah, we would like to read another edition from you. I know it's super time consuming, but yeah. There's another question in the chat. It says, thank you for your presentation. I would like to know if the book addresses the topics of citizenship, ethnicity, and the informal sector.
Do you want me to go first? Odile and Sara? Yeah. So, I mean, it does, thank you for the question. It doesn't tackle these topics, very directly, say, in a specific chapter, but these are cross-cutting themes that emerge in a number of chapters. So there is a lot about migration that, that might relate to your reference to citizenship, I imagine, that, comes across, for example, when we talk about global care chains, but also not only in that occasion. Ethnicity is an axis of power that matters when we think about a number of feminist topics, and it is something that is mentioned across a number of chapters. And the informal sector, likewise, it comes across when we talk about the global division of labor. There is a specific part that looks at processes of informalization, but also I believe in the chapter of labor market inequalities, there is a reference to the informal economy and work organized in the informal sector. Yeah.
So I think I will use my power of moderator and then ask one question before we close, before we wrap up. So you mentioned like possibility of second edition, and also because the topics that you want to add, like you couldn't add in the first one, and then maybe you can explore more. So you mentioned that a little bit, but I want to ask, like, what would be your priority in terms of topics that if you need to write this book tomorrow? Like the topics which is not included in the current version, but you want to include it immediately in the next one.
Well, I think, sorry, will I just jump in first? I mean, I think some of the ones, for example, we tried to have a kind of climate change as a cross-cutting theme of the book, but I think it certainly deserves a chapter in its own right. So that would be one. I think also, just as that last question indicated, I think migration, is such another key issue for so many countries. I think, a chapter focused on that would be a very good one. And I suppose maybe there's something theoretical too about how, if and how feminist economics, feminist political economy is managing to what role it's playing in kind of influencing classical or neoclassical approaches, and how things that are happening within economics itself, the changes that are already kind of underway, how they can all talk to each other in a more constructive way rather than different silos, I think. I'm a particular fan of Nancy Folbury's approach, which seems to me to be about developing a more unified approach to thinking about the economic world. Engaging with the best of what's on offer from a variety of approaches within economics, drawing on those, different schools of thought, mixing and matching theories and concepts, and incorporating tools like bargaining models, game theory, etc. But having feminist theory as key to that because of the attention it calls to gender, and also paying attention to intersectionality.
So you see that you already have 3 new chapters there, plus the chapter on statistics that was suggested by Marcella earlier. I will add one more, which is a chapter on basically agrarian issues, so land and food, which is also very close to my heart, but for some reasons I didn't think of writing a chapter on this in the book. Odile, I don't know, do you want to add a 5th chapter?
I think perhaps something we briefly mentioned towards like the end-ish. I can't even remember when the end was. It was also fuzzy. But something on governance and global governance, I think would fit well with the topic on, well, with the title, which is the global perspective. I do think we touch on governance here and there implicitly in some of the chapters, you know, talking about social reproduction, the global division of labor, welfare regime, and also the chapter on GDP and its alternatives, but perhaps something that more explicitly sort of outlines the topic and how it relates to feminist political economy.
Wow, great. I'm excited to read these new chapters soon as possible. Thank you. Thank you for all these last reflections, and thank you for all these valuable insights. And I really hope that more scholars and students access your book and feel the power of feminist political economy, and also experience the liberation of adopting a feminist political economy in their thinking with a global perspective, of course. Thank you to the authors and to all who joined the session. And please look out for upcoming online events. And we are so appreciated to host you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much, yes.